Well, today, the President of the United States switched from insulting his Director of National Intelligence yesterday by name and the thousands of intelligence personnel in Washington and around the world who supply the president with the very best intelligence that they can provide. The president went from insulting all of them yesterday to insulting his voters today. The president told one of those Trump lies that no one else in the history of public life in America would ever attempt to tell. Donald Trump and everyone in the Trump White House know that most Americans know that Donald Trump is an uncontrollable liar. The president knew he had no hope of convincing most voters today that he didn't mean to say what he said yesterday. The president knows that most voters, most Americans, most children are way too smart to fall for the lie that Donald Trump told today. But Donald Trump must not see his voters that way. Former CIA Director John Brennan yesterday said that President Trump's comments yesterday were imbecilic. And today, Donald Trump took imbecilic to a whole new level. Donald Trump gave his voters an intelligence test that he seems to be very confident they will not pass, cannot pass. He said that he forgot to say one word yesterday that would completely reverse the meaning of one sentence that he said yesterday. The line that Donald Trump changed today came in the middle of his response to this question, which definitely was not an actual answer to the question.
Would you now, with the whole world watching, tell President Putin, would you denounce what happened in 2016, and would you warn him to never do it again?
So let me just say that we have two thoughts. You have groups that are wondering why the FBI never took the server. Why haven't they taken the server?
As the whole world knows, Donald Trump did not have the courage or the integrity to denounce what happened in 2016 yesterday, and he did not have the courage to warn Vladimir Putin, standing right beside him, to never do it again. Instead, Donald Trump rambled through a response in which he ended up saying this.
All I can do is ask the question. My people came to me, Dan Coates came to me, and some others. They said they think it's Russia. I have President Putin. He just said it's not Russia. I will say this. I don't see any reason why it would be, but I really do want to see the server. But I have confidence in both parties.
The president very clearly just said, I don't see any reason why it would be. It would be Russia. What he meant was it would be Russia that mounted a cyber war on the American election in 2016. And today, the president tried to repair all of the damage that he did yesterday by simply inserting one word in that sentence.
I got a transcript. I reviewed it. I actually went out and reviewed a clip of an answer that I gave. And I realized that there is a need for some clarification. It should have been obvious. I thought it would be obvious, but I would like to clarify just in case it wasn't. In a key sentence in my remarks, I said the word would instead of wouldn't. The sentence should have been, I don't see any reason why I wouldn't, or why it wouldn't be Russia. So just to repeat it, I said the word would instead of wouldn't. And the sentence should have been, and I thought it would be maybe a little bit unclear on the transcript or unclear on the actual video. The sentence should have been, I don't see any reason why it wouldn't be Russia.
Did the self-described stable genius come up with that all by himself? Obviously not. That's why he had to read a written statement. And we know Donald Trump doesn't write anything, and Donald Trump is not reluctant to share his ideas. That's why he tweets around the clock. And this was an easily tweetable fix 24 hours ago. 24 hours ago, Donald Trump was at home in the White House watching television and seeing the massive onslaught of criticism he was getting, including from Republicans, for saying what he said yesterday. And the line that he decided to change today was quoted many times last night. So obviously, yesterday and last night, Donald Trump didn't think there was anything wrong with saying that he couldn't see any reason at all why Russia would attack our election in order to help Donald Trump. But it took a full 24 hours for Donald Trump to try and insert that one new word into that sentence. And whose idea was that? NBC News national correspondent Peter Alexander is reporting tonight that a source familiar with the conversation confirms to NBC News that Vice President Mike Pence and Secretary of State Michael Pompeo had a private conversation with President Trump to urge him to make clarifications on his comments from the news conference with Vladimir Putin in Helsinki. And so the two Mikes came up with the one-word solution. Just change that one word and everything's going to be okay. Donald Trump will not survive the Mueller investigation or an impeachment investigation if his lawyers are not much, much better than the two Mikes. There were many problems in what the president had to say yesterday, but the one that the two Mikes were trying to solve was the spot where the president seems to equate the integrity and judgment of Dan Coats, his director of national intelligence, with the integrity and judgment of his new friend Vladimir Putin. The president said, my people came to me, Dan Coats came to me, and some others. They said they think it's Russia. I have President Putin. He just said it's not Russia. I will say this. I don't see any reason why it would be. That is what the president said yesterday. And changing that one word changes only the meaning of that one sentence. It doesn't change the meaning of any other sentence that the president said yesterday. It doesn't change the part where he equates Dan Coats and Vladimir Putin. Let's listen to that one more time.
All I can do is ask the question. My people came to me, Dan Coats came to me, and some others. They said they think it's Russia. I have President Putin. He just said it's not Russia. I will say this. I don't see any reason why it would be, but I really do want to see the server. But I have confidence in both parties.
But I have confidence in both parties. That sentence came after the sentence that the two Mikes tried to change. The two Mikes did not change that sentence, I have confidence in both parties. To make the two Mike story work, they would have had to change that sentence too. They would have to change that sentence to, I do not have confidence in both parties. They'd have to put another not in there. I do not have confidence in both parties. And then they would have had to invent a sentence that Donald Trump never said, which is, I have confidence in Dan Coats, who told me the truth about what Russia did, and I have no confidence in President Putin's denial. The one word fix fixed nothing. The two Mikes failed, but they obviously engaged in a mighty struggle with Donald Trump because it took them 24 hours to go along with their plan. But then, even after executing their plan, Donald Trump ruined their plan by taking his eyes off the words they had written for him and adding a few words of his own.
Let me be totally clear in saying that, and I've said this many times, I accept our intelligence community's conclusion that Russia's meddling in the 2016 election took place. Could be other people also. There's a lot of people out there.
I accept their conclusion, but I don't. Could be other people also. As soon as he takes his eyes off the words that the two Mikes had written for him, Donald Trump destroys what the two Mikes sent him out there to do. He says it could be anyone who did it. Anyone. What does Dan Coats know? He's just the director of national intelligence. Donald Trump doesn't have confidence in him. It could be anyone. No confidence in the FBI, no confidence in the CIA, no confidence in the NSA, no confidence in anyone involved in the American investigation of what happened in 2016, and certainly absolutely no confidence in Robert Mueller's indictment on Friday, giving the names of the 12 Russian military officers who were launching the cyber missiles into our presidential campaign to hurt the Clinton campaign and help the Trump campaign. No one believes what Donald Trump said today. No one. Not one member of Congress believes it. Not one elected Republican in Washington believes what Donald Trump said today. Today's comments were aimed at Trump voters and no one else, because Donald Trump knows no one else will believe a word of what he said today. And so the question for the remaining Trump voters tonight is just how many insults can they take from Donald Trump? The question for Trump voters tonight is Donald Trump right about them? Will they believe anything that he says? Anything? Will Trump voters believe Donald Trump's ridiculous lie today, which Donald Trump himself contradicted in things he said yesterday and again in things he said today after he told the lie? Only an imbecilic audience can fall for an imbecilic performance. Donald Trump proved once again today that he firmly believes that the voters who he once affectionately called the poorly educated will believe anything he wants them to believe and will accept any insult to their intelligence as long as that insult to their intelligence comes from Donald Trump, as it did today. Leading off our discussion now, Ned Price, former senior director and spokesperson for the National Security Council in the Obama administration. He's also a former CIA analyst. Jill Wine-Banks, former assistant Watergate special prosecutor, is here. And Tim O'Brien, executive editor of Bloomberg View and the author of Trump Nation, The Art of Being the Donald. They are all MSNBC contributors. And Ned, I want to go to you on what Donald Trump did again today. He once again today publicly said he does not believe the American intelligence community. He does not believe Dan Coats. It could be anyone who did this. And he said that in a mission he was obviously primed for by others in the White House, apparently Mike Pompeo and Mike Pence. He said that in the middle of that mission where he was supposed to go out there and express confidence in the intelligence community.
Well, that's right, Lawrence. If you think our heads are spinning, trying to disentangle, trying to fathom how the White House could think we are so imbecilic, to use your words, just imagine how this is playing out at Langley, how this is playing within our national security workforce. You know, as I was digesting all of this yesterday and reflecting upon what has to be one of the most shameful days of the Trump presidency, I heard from a former colleague who's still currently at CIA, and this person started his message with, what in the hell are we doing? What in the hell are we doing? And he wasn't talking at a policy level. He wasn't talking about bilateral relations between Moscow and Washington. It was an existential question that has to be on the mind of all of those, or at least many of those, who have dedicated their careers with little pay and even less recognition, risking, in some cases, life and limb to protect their country for a commander-in-chief, a first customer who is willing to trash them on the world stage and to trash them in front of their nemesis, no less. And, you know, we talk a lot about workforce morale in the federal government and the implications therein. You know, there may be less productivity if workers are unhappy if they don't get their annual pay increase. But there are real implications when it comes to our national security workforce and especially our intelligence community. And what scares me about all of this, Lawrence, is that sometimes we don't see those implications until it's far, far too late.
Jill Wine-Banks, we saw again today a demonstration of why Donald Trump's lawyers don't want him to go anywhere near a grand jury or anywhere near an interview with Robert Mueller. Here he is trying to correct a statement that he made yesterday and trying to do it in the most unbelievable possible way by trying to insert this one word. And then in that process of trying to fix it, he says the thing again that he wasn't supposed to say.
It is a big mistake on his part, but even the idea of correcting one word is absurd, because it isn't just the one sentence or the one word that was upsetting to the American people yesterday. It was the whole context. It was his standing side by side with President Putin and ignoring. First of all, he said that Coats said he thinks it's Russia. Coats did not say he thinks it's Russia. He said it is Russia. All of the intelligence agencies have said that. A detailed indictment was issued, and it's being prosecuted now by the National Security Division of the Department of Justice that names 12 GRU Russian military intelligence officers as defendants, and it lays out very clearly the acts that were done by the Russians under the leadership of Putin. And when Donald Trump stands there and says, well, there was nothing I could do except ask the question, that is not true. He is the President of the United States. He could say, I will not meet with you. I will not negotiate with you. I will not cooperate with you unless and until you extradite these 12 men to stand trial in America. And even Putin said it's up to our justice system to resolve these things. If that's true, then he should be grateful for the opportunity to send these people to America to stand trial and for people to see exactly what Putin and the GRU did to interfere with our election. And we need to protect our election. We need to take action to stop this from happening 4 months from now.
So, Tim O'Brien, Mike Pence is one of the co-authors of the new version of the Trump statement. So I think it could be interesting to listen to what Mike Pence said yesterday about Donald Trump. And this is after Donald Trump had completed the press conference. Mike Pence seemed to think yesterday that every word Donald Trump said was great. Let's listen to this.
And earlier today, President Trump completed what he described as a direct, open, and deeply productive dialogue with President Putin in Helsinki. What the world saw, what the American people saw, is that President Donald Trump will always put the prosperity and security of America first.
So that's the guy. Yesterday, he saw nothing wrong with what Donald Trump said yesterday.
Well, and then obviously walked into the same whirlwind that Trump did after all of this hit the news, which is that everyone watching that show globally saw Trump behaving exactly the same way he's been behaving over the last year. He has repeatedly been an apologist for Vladimir Putin. He has repeatedly tried to absolve the Russians from any involvement in this. And nothing was really new about that conference except for two things. He was standing next to Putin, and it was televised. And I think they all realized when they came back home that they had to somehow try to roll this back. But you can't roll Donald Trump back. As you saw, he even scripted, he could not stay on script because we know already there's a voluminous record about how he thinks about this. And he is not going to acknowledge that Russia played a role sabotaging the 2016 election because it cuts to the core of a couple of things he's deeply concerned about, one of which is the Mueller investigation.
Jeanne Shaheen and other Democratic senators are now calling on the interpreter, the U.S. interpreter who was involved, to participate in a hearing. Jeanne Shaheen said, "I'm calling for a hearing with the U.S. interpreter who was present during President Trump's meeting with Putin to uncover what they discussed privately. This interpreter can help determine what POTUS shared, promised Putin on our behalf." And Ned Price, that is unprecedented, but the meeting was unprecedented. And we've already seen that Donald Trump can't keep his story straight from one day to the next in terms of dealing with Vladimir Putin. And these translators do often take notes because, as we saw yesterday, for example, with Vladimir Putin, he can speak at length. And for a translator to translate it all, they have to write down certain notes about what Vladimir Putin said. What do you make of this Democratic demand in the Senate to hear from the translator?
Well, you're right, Lawrence, that this would be unprecedented, but all of this is unprecedented. I think we have to throw this quaint notion of precedent out the window. When it comes to the motion that Senator Shaheen put forward, look, the fact of the matter is that this translator, if I'm not mistaken, is a State Department employee. At the very least, is a U.S. government employee. And this translator not only has information that could well be relevant to ongoing congressional inquiries, but is certainly relevant to our national security, is certainly relevant and is in fact what was agreed to behind closed doors between Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump. And just today, the Russians, as we expected all along, have started to roll out statements about, oh yes, this agreement that the two presidents reached. Well, we didn't hear about any of these agreements the two presidents reached. Only one other person on our side did, and it's this translator. It's incumbent upon the U.S. Congress to perform this oversight role because the White House is not interested in being candid with the American people. Congress must. Congress must get to the bottom of what exactly was agreed to for our own national security's sake.
Jill, will Robert Mueller subpoena the translator to testify to a grand jury?
I'm not sure that there's anything directly relevant to the Mueller probe in this, except if he did actually talk about anything to do with the interference in the election. And although he says that he raised the question, he doesn't say that they had any lengthy discussion about it. With all the things facing Mueller, I would say that the translator is not going to be high on his list, nor do I think actually subpoenaing Donald Trump should be high on the list, because We've seen time and time again that his answers do not have any relationship to the truth or the facts, and so why bother asking him any questions that you will not get truthful answers to? We need to have more interviews of people who don't have a preconceived notion of what they're going to say, regardless of what the facts are. And there's a lot that still needs to be done. I hope that Mueller can be left alone and that we can stop attacking him. This was another attack on the Department of Justice. Donald Trump, ignored the indictment, which is so detailed that it's hard for anyone to read that and not see that President Putin was in charge of interfering in our election. That is a big threat to our democracy, and it's something that it should have been the #1 thing on Donald Trump's agenda in protecting America. He took an oath to protect our laws and to see that the rule of law took place, and he is absolutely not doing that, and that concerns me the most of all.
Thank you to everyone for getting us started on our first panel tonight. Thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on the button below for more from The Last Word and the rest of MSNBC.